Lecture 6.2.1, Pavlov and Classical Conditioning. Ivan Pavlov was a Russian physiologist who won the 1904 Nobel Prize for his study of digestion. He used dogs as his subjects. Later in his career, he turned to the study of learning, the simplest type of learning, which is now called Pavlovian or classical conditioning. Many aspects of our behavior consist of learned responses to signals. The text definition of classical conditioning is the process by which an organism learns a new association between two paired stimuli, a neutral stimulus and one that already evokes a reflexive response. Classical conditioning is an everyday form of learning in which two stimuli that are presented together become associated with each other. Whenever one stimulus predicts a second stimulus that produces a response, we have the conditions necessary for classical conditioning. Pavlov studied conditioning of the salivary response in dogs simply because he had been studying digestion with dogs as his subject throughout his career. There are four components in classical conditioning: the unconditioned or unlearned stimulus, the unconditioned or unlearned response, and the conditioned stimulus and the conditioned response, or learned stimulus and learned response. In this diagram from the text, we have the neutral stimulus that will become the conditioned stimulus, and that is the metronome. It initially produces no particular response in the dog. The unconditioned stimulus is meat, actually meat in the dog's mouth, which produces salivation. That's the unconditioned response. So meat in the mouth produces salivation. That's unlearned. That's an inborn reflex. Here is a typical training or acquisition trial. First, the CS, the sound, which is followed about a half second later by the UCS, or the food in the dog's mouth, and the UCR, the salivation. And after a number of these training trials or acquisition trials, the metronome sound becomes a conditioned stimulus. That is, the formerly neutral stimulus now evokes a response, the conditioned response, or salivation. Dog has learned to salivate to the sound of the metronome. The conditioned response is not exactly the same as the unconditioned response. For example, the unconditioned response to an electric shock is something like shrieking and jumping, flinching, whereas the conditioned response to a stimulus paired with a shock, such as a warning signal, is tensing of the muscles and lack of activity. The eye blink response is a popular one for researchers to use in the laboratory. This diagram in the textbook shows the procedure for conditioning the eye blink response. Initially, the sound of the beep is a neutral stimulus that does not produce an eye blink, and a puff of air to the eye is an unconditioned stimulus that reflexively produces an eye blink. During the acquisition trials, the beep is followed by the puff of air, beep, puff of air, beep, puff of air, and after a number of these acquisition trials, the sound alone, the tone or the beep, produces an eye blink. So this person has learned to blink to the tone. Remember the story about John Watson moving from psychology into advertising. Well, here's an everyday example of classical conditioning in advertising. We have a neutral stimuli, another pair of jeans, clothing, and we want that neutral stimuli to become a CS that elicits some type of positive response in the consumer. So a very common technique is to pair our neutral product with an unconditioned stimulus that already elicits the unconditioned response. An attractive person is a common unconditioned stimulus because that produces a positive response in most people. So in a typical advertisement here, we pair our neutral product with an unconditioned stimulus with an attractive person, and after a number of these acquisition trials, the neutral product elicits a positive emotional response in the consumer. Conditioning occurs more rapidly when the conditioned or neutral stimulus is relatively unfamiliar. If you are already used to or habituated to the neutral stimulus, it will take longer for its pairing with an unconditioned stimulus to form a connection for you. The example cited in the textbook is, imagine two people who are bitten by a snake, one who has never been close to a snake before, and one who tends snakes at the zoo. You can guess which one will develop a fear of snakes quicker. Pavlov used the term signal learning to refer to what we now call classical conditioning. Another term used is preparatory learning. Classical conditioning prepares an individual for likely events. It has survival value. The conditioned stimulus serves as a signal that something is about to happen, so you had better get prepared. To weaken a conditioned response, you simply present the conditioned stimulus without following it with the unconditioned stimulus. That is, you would ring the tone without putting food in the dog's mouth. Each of these is called an extinction trial. unreinforced trial. And this chart shows the amount of salivation the conditioned response weakens with each unreinforced trial. The book notes that extinction and forgetting are not the same thing. Forgetting refers to memory. Both extinction and forgetting weaken the learned response, but they arise in different ways. Forgetting occurs when we have no opportunity to practice something over time, whereas extinction occurs as a result of specific experiences. Spontaneous recovery is an interesting phenomenon, and it points out that extinction does not appear to lead to unlearning. Extinction rather somehow suppresses a conditioned response rather than erasing a learned association. For example, even if you manage to rid yourself of an unwanted conditioned response, such as a cringing when you hear a dental drill, there is an excellent chance that it may make a reappearance later. This temporary return of an extinguished response is called spontaneous recovery. This diagram from the textbook summarizes what we have learned thus far. Before training, the musical note, which is the conditioned stimulus, produces no salivation, whereas the meat in the dog's mouth produces salivation. During acquisition, the tone or music is sounded before the US. During extinction, the tone alone is sounded till the response to it is extinguished, and then we have a pause, and then the tone is presented again, and spontaneous recovery occurs with the salivation. Stimulus generalization is defined as the extension of a conditioned response from the original CS to similar stimuli. Stimulus generalization occurs when an organism that has learned a response to a specific stimulus responds in the same way to new stimuli that are similar to the original stimulus. The more similar the new stimuli are to the original CS, the greater the generalization. This is what is called a stimulus generalization gradient. On the x-axis, we have the frequency of the conditioned stimuli. In the middle is the original CS at 200. And on the y-axis, we have the intensity of the conditioned response. Whatever that response is, maybe salivation. And you can see that the strongest response, the most salivation, is produced by the original CS. And to either side, the less similar the new stimuli is to the original, the weaker the CR, the weaker the amount of salivation. Stimulus discrimination is just the opposite of stimulus generalization. Stimulus discrimination occurs when an organism that has learned a response to a specific stimulus does not respond in the same way to new stimuli that are similar to the original stimulus. Like generalization, discrimination is adaptive in that an animal's survival may hinge on its being able to distinguish friend from foe or edible from poisonous food. A traffic light might be used as an example of both generalization and discrimination. With generalization, we respond the same to different shades of green. With discrimination, we react differently to different stimuli. We respond differently to green or red lights.